Okay, get that going. Judges 16. Are you familiar with the term pericope? Anybody heard that before?
Bless you.
Heard it.
Thank you. All right, Abigail, were you going to say something? Oh, I thought I saw your hand. Okay, we are talking about narrative. We are talking about narrative structure. And once we are done going through the details of the Samson narrative, we are going to look at how it is structured, because that helps us to follow the line of thought and to understand how a story is put together. Communicates a lot of the purpose of the story, the purpose of the narrative. So we are talking in a broad sense about narrative. This is a word that just means story. So the narrative of Samson is a story that happens within the entire book of Judges. The book of Judges is a narrative, and it has an overarching theme about the decline of the nation of Israel to where they become indistinguishable from their pagan neighbors. And we also see that decline reflected in the judges themselves, and we especially see that in the life of Samson. So Judges is a narrative, and it is constructed with a series of smaller stories. You can kind of think of it as a TV series where you have episodes. And so usually an episode is a series or a sequence of events that take us through a timeline in our Western storytelling. As we've seen in biblical narrative, it's not necessarily the time frame or the sequence from year to year or decade to decade. That's not the point in biblical narrative. It's not the framework in biblical narrative. But usually an episode contains a series of events, or with a focus on maybe one main thing that's happening, but it fits within the larger structure of the story. A pericope. This is spelled Pericope. Pericope. A pericope is an excerpt. It is it's kind of like a little self-contained story, but it belongs within the larger set, and it doesn't necessarily fall in chronological sequence. Usually an episode is building a series of cause and effect. It is building the narrative from the beginning, and it takes you step by step through the escalation of a conflict to the climax of the story and then the resolution. A pericope is a isolated little story that fits within these things. And for instance, in the Gospels, you have a bunch of pericopes. There is the woman at the well pericope. That little episode, if you want to call it that, begins with Jesus and his disciples going into Samaria. And then there's his conversation with the woman at the well, and the disciples come back. So it's an isolated little story by itself. That is a pericope. In Judges 16, we have 3 pericopes, and they are organized geographically. We have Gaza, the pericope of Gaza, where Samson rips the gates out of the wall. Then we have the Delilah pericope, where we are now. That happens in the Valley of Sorek. And then we have the death of Samson pericope, which is back in Gaza. So we go from Gaza to Sorek, back to Gaza. So in this Delilah pericope, we have already talked about a couple of things that are going on here. And we noted that there are a lot of parallels between the Delilah Pericope and the wedding pericope in Judges 14. And there are also some significant differences, and we pointed out a couple of them. We had a couple of big differences that we talked about last time. Can you remember what those are? What are some big differences between the pericope of the wedding of Cana and the Delilah pericope?
Well, it gave us her name, and
Mhm.
it didn't give us his other wife's name.
Right, right. That's a big one. And one other.
It says that he loved Delilah, but in the other one it says that she just, like, his first wife just like pleased him.
Right, right. Yeah, and not just his first wife, but probably his only wife. He had a problem with women, especially with Philistine women, which is an interesting thing because there's so many things about the life of Samson are contrary to his calling. And his calling, his purpose was to begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. He was to be a judge to start this work, which would last well over 100 years, ending with David finally subduing the Philistines. But it began with Samson, and his weakness was his attraction to the women of his enemy. It's like he was resisting his entire life, not only his calling as a Nazarite, but also his calling as a judge to free his people from the Philistines. It's interesting, and we noted this last time, that Samson's purpose was to begin to deliver Israel. But every time Samson was in conflict with the Philistines, it was his personal reaction out of anger to bring revenge for his personal wrongs that he suffered. There was never in Samson's conflict with the Philistines a representation of the nation of Israel. It was always about himself, even in his death, which we will see when we get to that part. So Samson is what you might call the anti-hero. He is the main focus. He is the protagonist of this story. He is supposed to be the hero of this story and champion his people in conflict with the Philistines. But he is an anti-hero. He is one that we do not want to emulate. And we see the overriding sovereignty of God in his life is that even though Samson is driven by his own impulses and is continually finding himself in situations of his own doing, God still uses that to accomplish his purpose. And that's one of the big themes of the story of Samson, is that God is bigger than even our evil intentions. So that can be a comfort to us, even though Samson is a tragic anti-hero. So let's take a look in Judges 16. And the Delilah pericope starts in 16 verse 4. We've already talked through some of this. Afterward, it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So we talked about this. One thing that we didn't mention, who are these lords of the Philistines? That's not real clear. Obviously, they are people of power and influence. In other passages, we read about the kings of the Philistines, and these were probably the the top of the hierarchy within the main capital cities of the whole area of Philistines. And the lords is kind of a general term. It could refer to them, or it could just refer to people of power serving under those kings. But whatever the case is, these were representations or representatives of the political power of the Philistine nation. And so they are the ones that asked Delilah to get involved with bringing Samson down. And we talked about the fact that she doesn't object to this at all. Her response was just, sure. She just goes at it. In verse 6, Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies and with what you may be bound to afflict you. Now, we talked before about how this, this just seems to be a really strange way to kind of interrogate Samson. We talked about how this is kind of an echo of the riddle game in Samson's wedding. In chapter 14, he poses a riddle, and there are high stakes involved. Here in chapter 16, the stakes are much higher because it's involving capturing Samson with the intent of afflicting him. Now, I was reading about this, and there's another interesting take that I would like your impressions about. This whole series, there are 4 questions posed to Samson. The same question, but 4 times applied to Samson. And there are some subtle differences as we go through the sequence of this game that Samson becomes a part of. Some people have described the rounds of this gaming that Samson participates in seemingly with some enthusiasm and enjoyment. But this give and take, this series of questions has been described as a sort of ritualized dance of death, which is a very interesting way to describe it, because if you go from the beginning to the end, you see that this is where this game is leading, and it does end in Samson's death. And this give and take, it's almost like a game of chicken. Who is going to yield first, Delilah or Samson? And we have seen him yield to the pressure of a woman, a Philistine woman, before in chapter 14. So this whole thing about, am I missing something? There's some jokes or something I'm not hearing. Okay, all right. So this gaming that is going on, and the way that Delilah poses her questions to Samson, tell me the secret of your great strength, with what can you be bound to afflict you? She includes that in there, and it just is kind of really puzzling that she would do this. We know that Samson loves her, and she obviously knows that too. And apparently he has told her this, because later on she says, how can you say that you love me? You compare that with chapter 14, where Samson is involved in this riddle game in his wedding. She doesn't say, his wife doesn't say, how can you say you love me? With the same kind of elements to the story that we see here with Delilah. And so I read this, I want to read it to you. Since the secret of Samson's great strength is what every Philistine wants to know, but can't, To ask him to reveal it to her alone is to tell him she wants to be his soulmate, to know him as no one else does, to be as close to him as only a lover can be. In a paradoxical way, it is a declaration of her professed love for him. It shows how well that she knows Samson, and she knows that he is aroused by danger rather than being repelled by it. So what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, every time Samson tells her supposedly how he can be made weak, he wakes up and finds himself in that exact situation. So eventually he must have caught on,
Yeah.
which also leads to another question, but that can wait.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Make sure that we don't go past wherever your question is. Yeah, I thought this was really interesting because his willingness to engage in this game is very characteristic of him. It's also very characteristic of him to just ignore the danger, to just kind of, push it aside as that is not a factor. The danger to me, that's just something that I enjoy. So it makes sense. And I think it's not bending it too much out of perspective for anything that we can kind of glean from the text about the character of Delilah. She obviously is manipulating him, and she knows him very well. And so I think this is probably a pretty good insight by telling him she wants to know what nobody else knows, and that is how to bind him. Nobody's been able to do that before. It's been attempted. And to afflict him. Tell me your weakness. This is a very, very intimate thing that would be very appealing to Samson. So instead of maybe just wondering why on earth would Delilah tip her hand and tell Samson that the purpose of binding him is to afflict him. That is very puzzling. But if you see it from the perspective of, I want to know things about you that nobody else knows. Obviously, you are so strong that nobody can oppose you. So where is your weakness? That is a conversation between two people who are so close that there is an assumption of deep abiding trust and vulnerability. Samson doesn't take it that way, because if he does, or if he did, he would have just told her right away. But instead, he engages in this game with her and teases her several times. So it's just a really interesting thing to think about, about how on earth can Samson get involved in this kind of thing. But it goes along with his character. It goes along with her character. And we are told at the very beginning of this story that he loves her. So just a really interesting thing to think about. Okay, so we enter the game. In verse 7, Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. So let's just pause there for a few minutes. There are so many little elements in this story and these sequence of events that we are not told. Samson says, here's what you need to bind me. And we just read that in verse 8 that the lords of the Philistines brought up to her. So obviously there had to be some communication going back and forth between Delilah and the lords of the Philistines. Where were they? Were they hiding out in the valley? We know that at some point in the last probably few years, Samson had destroyed the crops of that valley. I'm sure that by this point they have been recovered. We don't know what town in the valley he is in. It would be really ironic if he were in Timnah, but we're not told that. But somehow Delilah got word to the lords of the Philistines. They have been waiting. This is the first time that she poses the question to Samson. This is his first response. And so now things move into place. This ambush that was attempted in Gaza, but now they brought what they are hoping to be the secret of disarming Samson and getting him into the condition where they can actually capture him. So they bring these bowstrings. Now then, it's mentioned twice, once in verse 7 and once in verse 8. These bowstrings are not yet dried. What is that referring to?
Does it mean they're fresh, so they're stronger?
Yeah. And what were, I should have had you do some mini reports for this week, but I didn't even think about that. What were bowstrings made of that had to be dried?
Animal guts.
Yes. Okay, so Samson is telling Delilah, bring parts of a dead animal that are fresh, not yet dried, and bind me with them. What's the problem with that?
It's disgusting.
Yes, it is.
Samson's not supposed to touch a corpse.
Yeah. This is another violation of the Nazarite vow. And he is the one who suggests this. So this brings up the whole question again about Nazarite vow. What on earth did Samson understand about this, if anything? We do finally hear from Samson himself in this Delilah Pericope that he was fully aware that he was a Nazarite, but how aware was he of the elements, of the requirements, the prohibitions of being a Nazarite? Here, his first response to Delilah was, bring me parts of a dead animal. Really interesting. How about the number 7? The number 7 comes up twice in this pericope. Here in his first response, and then in his third response, when he is perilously close to giving away the secret, and he talks about his hair. He says the 7 locks of his hair. Now, people love to go in and make all kinds of things, points, applications about the numbers that are used in Scripture. Is there any significance here to the use of the number 7 twice in this game that Samson involves himself with?
Is 7 like the number of like completion or something? So it's like fully?
Yeah. In the Jewish mind frame, if there's going to be significance to the use of a number, that's what it would usually point to. Some people say it's the number of perfection, but completion is closer to the idea, like you were saying. It's very doubtful that Samson is making reference to any kind of Jewish significance to the number 7. Who's he talking to? He's talking to a Philistine woman. So some people, some scholars think, and there's no direct proof of this anywhere, so they just kind of suppose that Philistines, being a typical pagan culture with a lot of superstition, is that the number 7 has some kind of magical reference to it. And, like the source of power. Obviously, to the Philistine thinking, this was some kind of magic or sorcery. They couldn't figure it out. That's why they want to know, what is the secret? What can we do to bind you and to get rid of this magic that you possess? So his first response to her by saying 7 fresh bowstrings not yet dyed, this would be very appealing, very compelling in the mind of a very superstitious culture that is oriented around magic and in sorcery. Now, again, this is just speculation, but it makes sense, and why both Delilah and the Philistines would have just jumped all over this. So it's a good reason, and it's something that certainly is a strong possibility. So they bring up these fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she binds him with them. Now, there are some subtle little differences as we go from event to event during this gaming sequence here. So make note of some of these details, and we'll see what the differences are as they progress. So she binds him with these bowstrings. And verse 9 is kind of humorous. It's men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room. So this is, like, how on earth there are, we don't know if it's the 5 lords of the Philistines, but because we're just told there are men lying in wait. These are probably soldiers, probably not the political leaders of the Philistines. These are probably soldiers, but we're not told that detail. But they were lying in wait, staying with her in the room. Obviously, they weren't standing around, and Samson was just looking at them. They were in hiding, and so after she binds him, she says, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." Now, because we're so familiar with this story, we kind of read into this how Delilah probably delivered that. But this is the first of a series of surprise, look who's here. So the very first one could easily have been like a shout of warning, like she was surprised. We know she wasn't. But this first reveal of his enemy being there, the Philistines are upon you, Samson, could have easily been done in a way that she's trying to cover up her involvement in the conspiracy against him. And we read, "But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire." Now, remember, when Samson was bound with new rope, which is going to come up again here in the next sequence, the people of Israel had bound Samson, and we pointed out the fact that when those bonds were broken, that they just kind of dissolved like they were ash, and it's not stated in a way that he broke them. Here it is stated that he broke the bonds, and he broke them as strands of yarn breaks when it touches fire. It was just like nothing. It was just gone. And then we read, "So the secret of his strength was not known." So here we're back to that phrase again, only this time it's not used in the sense of dramatic irony, where the reader is told something that the characters don't know. Here we are just told very simply that the answer to the riddle was not discovered. But what about the rest of this event? What's missing?
Is it this phrase, the strength of the Lord came upon him?
Yep, that's not here. And other elements to the story, to this particular one, because verse 10, then Delilah said to Samson, look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now, please tell me what you may be bound with. We're told right before that he broke the bowstrings. The secret of his strength was not known. And then we move on to round 2 of the game. What's missing?
Is it his reaction to trying to be bound?
Yeah, his reaction. And what else?
Delilah's reaction?
Yeah, hers. Yeah. And there's even more.
The men in the room didn't do anything.
Right, right. We're not told any of that. So you remember, in a biblical narrative, it's the theme, the topic is what is being given to the reader. Now, if this, and you probably have seen some kind of depiction of this in TV or a movie, or I don't know, VeggieTales might have something about Samson. I haven't seen that particular one, but we're just totally left with men in hiding in Delilah's room. Samson breaks the bonds and we hear nothing. So as Western storytellers and readers, we're sitting there, with like, yeah, and what happened? But that wasn't the point of the biblical narrative. The point is this sentence: the secret of his strength was not known. And so she moves on to round 2. It was just, wow, very amazing. Okay, so here we go. Verse 10, round 2 of the game. Then Delilah said to Samson, look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what you may be bound with. Okay, what's missing out of this statement compared to her first statement?
She doesn't say anything about him being like subdued.
Right, right. The first time she poses this to Samson to reveal the secret of his strength, she is very clear in the whole intent behind binding him, which is to afflict him. Now she drops that part. So why would she do that? Well, she is reproaching him. You've mocked me and told me lies. So if she was trying to, in her first statement to Samson, if she was trying to convey, look, I really care about you. I want to be close to you. Please tell me what your weakness is, because, people want to hurt you. And, if you tell me, maybe I can help you. And, if she was conveying that kind of idea, she was stating all of the elements that needed to be communicated to Samson. But this time, she is coming at him with an accusation of you're mocking me, you're lying to me. I want to know what you may be bound with. So maybe at this point, she is holding back the intent of afflicting him because she is still trying to keep some distance between herself and the Philistines who are wanting to get a hold of him to afflict him. I would think at minimum, Samson is pretty suspicious at this point. If she would have elaborated all the points like she did the first time, it would be very obvious, okay, she's in league with the Philistines to bring his downfall. But she is still approaching him at this point on a relational basis. You've mocked me, you're telling me lies. What is it that can bind you? So is he dumb enough to think that maybe she's being sincere? I don't know. He's obviously an immature adult who never grew up. He's enjoying this game. He wants to continue with it. We see from how she is positioning herself that she is very insightful. She knows her way around Samson. And she is very carefully playing this game. And she's in it for the money. And so here's her second attempt to get the answer out of Samson. So verse 11, he said to her, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Therefore, Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off his arms like a thread. Okay. Round two. Now, the people of Israel, especially of Judah, would have seen right through Samson's response because they did try this before. We are told specifically that they bound him with new ropes. There were 3,000 people of Judah who came to arrest Samson to deliver him to the Philistines, and they brought new rope and bound him with them, and he just broke them like they were nothing, just like we're reading here. So we read again that Delilah bound him, and then she gives the same warning. The Philistines are upon you. And once again, they are lying in wait in the room, and it came to nothing. He just broke them off. And we see again, we move from Samson escaping these bonds to round three. No detail given about Samson's reaction, about what happened to the Philistines. I would think they just hightailed it out of there, just ran like crazy. Did he pursue them? We have no idea. What we do know is that Samson is ready to continue with this game. And we will pick that up after break. Okay, see you at 9:15. There we go. Almost forgot to restart that. The Kabbalah is basically an allegorical hermeneutic. And it is an old approach, but it is basically a kind of hermeneutic that looks at the surface level of the text and has the assumption that there is a deeper hidden meaning that's almost like a Gnosticistic, superstitious kind of a thing. You know, the problem with any hermeneutical approach to scripture, other than historical, grammatical, literal interpretation, the problem with all of them is that it puts you as the reader in the driver's seat of determining meaning. So anything that does that is just wide open. And there are traditions that get set and become a guide for other people to use. But It just makes everything subjective. The only hermeneutical approach to scripture that is worth serious consideration is the literal approach, because it puts you in a objective. It makes the scriptures the objective text that we interpret from, rather than reading meaning into. So, yeah, the Kabbalah is very old and kind of a Jewish based allegorical approach to interpreting scripture. So anyway, yeah. Okay, so we are in the Delilah Pericope, looking at the rounds of teasing and counter teasing that's going on. Delilah is obviously getting very frustrated. And she's trying to manipulate Samson based on his emotional attachment to her. So it's she is leveraging his weakness. He is either oblivious to this, which I wouldn't doubt because of his immaturity that we see throughout his story, or he is just enjoying this game and is so focused on continuing it and delivering himself by these exploits of his great strength that he's ready for round 3. So, you know, it's really interesting that throughout the Samson narrative, we are told specifically about things that the characters don't know. And then we are shown examples of things that they don't know, from chapter 13 with Samson's parents not knowing what it meant to be a Nazarite. In the Delilah Pericope, we are kind of put in the position of not knowing what's going on. Those details that are not given at the end of each round about what happened to the Philistines, what did Samson do after breaking his bonds, what did Delilah do, what did the Philistines do, you know, we're not given any of that detail. Obviously, the characters know what's going on, but we're not given that detail. So it's a really masterful storytelling device, because of we have been in the seat of knowing what's going on and the characters are kind of oblivious. Now we're in the middle of something happening between these two characters and we don't know what's going on other than those few facts that we are given. So it's just it's a genius storytelling, and it's a way to really compel the reader to look closer and closer to figure out what's going on. So once again, there's no transition as we move from round 2 to round 3. And in this one, we have a couple of differences. We do have a mention of the number 7 again. And so let us get to verse 13. Delilah said to Samson, "Until now, you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with." Okay, this is very much a repetition of her previous reproach to him. "You don't care about me. You're just lying to me." He says to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom." And then that sentence is not even completed. It's just left dangling there. He doesn't finish his statement. "If you do this, then I will become weak like any other man." He just throws out the first part and lets her complete the thought, which is obvious. There's no problem with that. But here we could see he's kind of getting exasperated too. But he is so close to revealing the secret of his strength, we think. If you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom. This is interesting in a lot of different ways. What are locks? I don't have a lot of hair to deal with. Jariah, yours is growing out. What are locks?
Are they like braids or like dreadlocks?
Yeah, that kind of idea. He's never had a haircut, so how long that is, I have no idea. I've seen some pretty long hair on both men and women. Why do you arrange your hair in locks?
To keep it from getting in the way and like to keep it like clean and orderly, because otherwise it would just go everywhere and get tangled and everything.
Yeah, exactly. So we're getting a little bit of information here from Samson about his hair. It's not just blowing in the wind. He's not a gigantic fuzzball walking around the hills of Judea. It's kept, probably for very practical reasons. Never having had a haircut, how old is he at this point? How do you picture him? How old do you think he is?
I pictured him like in his 30s, around there.
Yeah. We are told at the end of chapter 15 that he judged Israel for 20 years. And at the end of this chapter, we're told that he judged Israel for 20 years. So those two time references tell us that the incidents that we're reading about in chapter 16 happened during his 20 years, and then at his death, obviously, that ended the 20-year period of him being a judge. So when did he start being a judge? We're not told explicitly, but what do you think?
I'm guessing either when he came of age or when he first started harassing the Philistines.
Yeah. Remember in chapter 14, after the wedding and all that, he had killed 30 Philistines, and then he went home. And then in chapter 15, we have the conflict between Samson and the Philistines escalating to the point where the Philistines come into Judah and confront Judah, and then they go down to get Samson to arrest him and give him to the Philistines. And they say, don't you know that the Philistines have dominion over us? What do you think you're doing? At that point, they didn't recognize him as judge. But probably very soon afterwards, because there was a great slaughter, we're not told how many people, but then there was that great slaughter of however many Philistines, but then there was the 1,000 that he killed. So probably at some point in those incidents, around those incidents, the people of Israel realized, oh, I think I know what's going on. Here's another judge who is defeating our enemies. We are not told at all about any of the judging that he did. And that is actually kind of a rare thing to read about in the book of Judges, is how did this judge thing happen? We just read that a judge was raised up and did this job for however many years. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that the book of Judges doesn't give you details about the judging that was going on. It's about the people. both the Israelites and the judge themselves. And we have the same thing kind of going on here with Samson. So yeah, probably in his 30s at this point, mid to late 30s. We have no idea how long Samson was in prison in Gaza. For next week, there are a couple of things that we'll do some more mini reports on. But anyway, so there are just a lot of unknowns. And so what is told in the Samson narrative, those are the things that we need to focus on in order to figure out, why is this story here? What is the point? So in verse 13, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom, the web is probably referring to some unfinished weaving that was going on. The way these looms would work is, they were kind of big wooden machines. They would have metal parts and stuff too. This was an age when iron was available, bronze was available. It's mentioned specifically that Samson was bound with bronze handcuffs. So looms were usually bolted to the floor. So if you're imagining Delilah's house with a dirt floor, erase that because these were very sophisticated people. You remember in Greek and Hebrew study tools, we read letters from Egypt. And we know that people back in these ancient times were very sophisticated. They did a lot of stonework. They did a lot of wood paneling. And so these are not just dirty, dusty places, huts built on dirt. These were substantial buildings, and a lot of the stonework is still around in the ruins of the cities. And a lot of times they are ruins because of earthquakes or fire, not because of any other structural, lack of anything. So in this house, it was either tiled flooring, and the loom would have been bolted to the floor, or wood flooring. A lot of times it was very decorative, very beautifully tiled. I have been in some of these ancient ruins in the Mediterranean area, and they're just beautiful tile work on the ground, the flooring of the homes. So her house was sufficient to hide whatever number of soldiers were there. This loom was a very common thing because weaving the garments was a need at that point. Now, this is an echo from chapter 14. What was the wager during the wedding feast?
Clothing.
Expensive clothes.
Yeah. Garments and linen garments. Linen was weaved, or do you say woven? So here Delilah had this loom. Was it in the same room? Was it in we don't know. But weave the 7 locks of my hair into the web of the loom. So there was some work already being done on this loom. It was in progress. And Samson says, take these 7 locks of my head. So obviously his hair was something that was important to him, because he did keep it in some kind of fashion. So it wasn't just wild and blowing in the wind. And he says to take the 7 locks of his head and weave it into the web of the loom. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. So here this loom bolted to the floor, he gets up and he just pulls himself away from the loom, and he pulls the batten and the web, the stuff that was in progress in the loom. He just rips it all away. And we don't know anything else. Again, what did he do with the Philistines? What happened? We don't know. But obviously this had no effect on him. Okay, but this was very dangerous. Samson is getting close to revealing the secret of his strength. But again, we have to ask the question, really? Is that really the secret of his strength? So we move to round 4, verse 15. Then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you'?" She's quoting him. He has told her how he feels about her. He's in love with her. She says, "How can you say that when your heart is not with me?" Okay, so now she's getting at the core of who he is. Where is his heart? You say you love me, but your heart is not in it. That's her reproach. Do you really love me? Show me your heart. You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies. Now, by this time, it should be very obvious to Samson, and I don't see how we can doubt it, that he knows what she's up to. And now she's just approaching him on a purely emotional level. You say you love me, but your heart is showing me otherwise. What you are doing is not consistent with loving me. And she continues with this approach to Samson. Before, all we have read is that she poses the challenge to him, and he responds in a tease, counter tease kind of a way, playing this game of chicken, who's going to yield first, and she's done with it. He's pretty exasperated too, because he got so close to really revealing himself. And you kind of wonder, did he give a real close answer because he's not sure about, really, should I tell her everything? He got real close, but not quite. So maybe he's not sure. But she presses this in verse 16. It came to pass when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him, so that his soul was vexed to death. You wonder how long that took. It took his wife less than a week. So apparently he doesn't have much tolerance for this kind of a strategy in getting him to break down. Did it take a week? I don't know. Delilah is a much stronger woman than his wife was. She is relentless, and she is just, she's a businesswoman. She's in league with the Philistine lords. She's after this money. She's a powerful woman. And so she presses him, and his soul was vexed to death. And you can imagine, because we know that Samson is in love with this woman, and she is just drilling him relentlessly for however many days. And so he finally tells her, verse 17, told her all his heart. So there's another mention of the word heart. She says, you say you love me, but your heart is not with me. And so we're told that he breaks down and tells her all his heart. and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. So finally, we get Samson telling us, yes, he does know he's a Nazarite. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. And now we finally get some detail about Delilah processing this information. We haven't seen this before. In verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines. Now, we don't know how this arrangement worked in the other rounds of this game. In the very first one, you remember that when he said that thing about the bowstrings, that the Philistines came up to her, so they weren't there yet, and they brought the bowstrings with them. And so there was this arrangement. Did that happen every time? They were gone every time and she called them back? Well, we don't know. But here we are told specifically that she called for them. And she says, come up once more, for he has told me all his heart. So the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hand. Did they do that before? Again, we don't know. We do know they brought the bowstrings the first time, but did they bring the money with them? Probably. But here we're told specifically they brought the money. Verse 19, she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Okay. So what is different this time in how this whole thing is going down?
She's not the one that tries to bind him.
Right.
Or yeah, subdue him.
Yeah. So this time we're told that she lulls him to sleep. She probably did that before, but this time we are told that that's what she's doing. But she's not the one now to take what he has told her and to act on it herself in terms of binding him and things like that. The binding that had happened before, what did she bind when she did the bowstrings and the rope? We're not told, are we? Alejandro?
I was going to say, I assume his hands and feet, but I don't know.
Yeah, probably at least his hands and feet. 7 bowstrings where they braided into a thick kind of rope thing and just bound his hands. A bowstring isn't all that long. Were they tied together end to end so that she could do his hands and his feet? We don't know. Some people think that, especially with the rope, that she probably wound not only his hands and his feet, but around his body, his torso, to hold his arms in. Again, we don't know. But whatever the binding was that happened, it was totally ineffective. And then he moves on to his hair. And his hair gets all bound up in the loom. This time, none of that is happening. She calls for a man. We have no idea, who this was, but this time it's just Delilah and one guy. And he shaved off the 7 locks of his head. Now, you wonder, how on earth can you sleep through getting your head shaved? Again, we don't know. But it could have been just a quick cutting of the 7 locks, shaving his head. Did he take a razor and actually shave his head? You kind of get that idea. But again, we don't know those detailed specifics. And then we read, again, at the very end of verse 19, Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. We haven't seen that before either, have we? Before, when she took what he told her and tied him up in whatever way, she just shouted, "The Philistines are upon you." We get that again this time, but before she says anything, we're told she began to torment him. What does that mean? What was she doing? What do you picture? What's going on in your head about that?
I picture her mocking him.
Yep. So maybe waking him up by what? Mocking, insulting. Yeah. Again, we don't know the specific details, but somehow she is tormenting him. And hadn't she already been tormenting him to get him to tell her the secret finally? Yeah, she was vexing him, pressing him, pestering him day after day. And now here he is asleep and she torments him. And we're told his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." So he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free." Free from what?
Free from the other traps.
Yeah, before there was some kind of physical binding going on. And he says the same kind of thing, but there are nothing binding him at this point. Alejandro, you had your hand up.
But it's not in relation to your present question.
That's okay. What was it?
I was going to ask, so he doesn't realize that the strength of the Lord had departed from him. He's broken just about every other Nazarite vow. He goes over them again when he's toying with Delilah. He goes through the animal guts. He's already killed a lion. He's killed a bunch of men. The ropes. He's it's been done to him already. And with his hair, I don't have a lot of hair, but if somebody shaved off my hair in the middle of the night and then I woke up, I'd notice my hair was missing pretty quick. Did Samson know that was the source of his strength, or was that the source of his strength even? Because it doesn't say that that cutting the hair made him lose his strength. That's what we just assume. Is it like what exactly is going on there? Because he doesn't know his strength's gone after his hair. I'm sure he notices his hair's gone.
Yeah, you would think so, because he has never felt his scalp before without hair on it. Even if it's summertime, obviously, I don't know if you guys have, had a beard or a mustache or something like that, and you shave it off the first time you go outside, the wind, is just like, oh, okay. So yeah, you would think it would be very obvious. So that raises a whole bunch of questions. If he were aware of any of the prohibitions of the Nazarite vow, especially the ones about death, some kind of body, he had killed the lion, he had killed a bunch of Philistines, he had his strength intact all the time that he was a warrior, and obviously had touched corpses before. But his strength was there. So if he were aware to that degree of what a Nazarite vow entailed, he could obviously been aware that his hair was gone, but still thought, oh, that doesn't matter. Nothing else ever mattered. And so I'm going to go out and act like I did before. And this brings up a point that we're going to spend some time on. What was the source of his strength?
The Spirit of God.
Yeah. And that's why we read the most tragic statement of this Samson narrative is verse 20 at the end. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. This is what really drills down to us as the reader the whole point of the use of irony throughout this narrative is what is not known by the characters in the story. We have seen this over and over again. And the most tragic part of this is that Samson did not know that the Lord had departed from him. So he goes out like he had always done. He says, like I have done before, I will shake myself free. I'm going to go out there and just do what I've always done, regardless of this dramatic, drastic change, the shaving of his head. Okay, so had the secret of his strength been revealed? In the eyes of the Philistines, yes. They thought they finally figured out the secret. So that brings us to ask the question, what was the point of the Nazarite vow? And how does that fit into the narrative of Samson? The thing about why not cut your hair? While you were under the Nazarite vow, what was the point of not cutting your hair?
It was like
I don't
a symbol of the separation, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it was. And what were you saying, Alejandro?
I was going to say there was a time they were supposed to cut it, and I don't remember if they were supposed to do it at the end of their vows, but any time that they had to reset, basically, and start over, they had to cut their hair or shave their head.
Yes. Yes, exactly. It was a symbol. It was a sign that I am under a Nazarite vow. And so if you had hair and you begin a Nazarite vow, you would shave your head. And so at the very beginning, anybody who knew you or even didn't know you, they would probably assume, oh, that person is under making a Nazarite vow. And for whatever period of time. Now, the tradition from one of the Jewish writings, the Mishnah, the traditional assumption is that the minimum time period of a Nazarite vow is 30 days. That's not prescribed in number 6. Number 6 just refers to however many days the vow would last. But the Mishnah, the Jewish traditional teaching was minimum was 30 days. And that kind of comes into play toward the end of chapter 16, because we read that Samson's hair starts growing back. So what time period was involved there? Maybe at least 30 days, or some people think it was years. Well, we don't know, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So this is another, we have a couple of layers of irony, the unknowns going on here at this point when Samson gets his hair shaved. First and most significant, and what is specifically pointed out to us in the story, is that Samson did not know that the Lord had departed from him. other layers of irony point to the fact that he didn't know where the source of his strength lay.
So when he told Delilah to cut his hair, did he actually know that it would work?
No. We could see that in his actions. And that could be part of the underlying his view of life, was that it was all just a game, and no matter what he did, God was going to be with him and give him this great strength. So what happens in a situation like this is there is this this thing called the signifier, the sign, and the signified. What is the sign pointing to? What are signs for? What do we use signs for? You're muted.
To
Go ahead, Alejandro.
to let people know what or where something is.
Okay, yep. And Jariah, what were you going to say? All right. A sign points to something. It is the signifier. It's pointing to something. In the Nazarite vow, the hair was a signifier. What was it signifying?
Consecration.
Yes, consecration, dedication to the Lord for something for a prescribed period of time. For Samson, it was his entire life. He would be a Nazarite from the womb. And as a sign of that, a razor is not going to touch his head. In chapter 13, when we are given this information, there are parts of the Nazarite vow that are given to Samson's mother. The angel tells her that Samson, this child that would be born, would be a Nazarite all the days of his life from the womb. And he says, so you don't have anything to do with anything of the vine. Keep yourself away from that stuff. And that was a prescribed period of time. From the time the announcement was given to the time that Samson was born, Manoah's wife, Samson's mother, was to keep herself as a Nazarite, but the baby would be a Nazarite from birth. And the only thing that the angel gives to Samson's mother that had to do with what Samson, how he would be living as a Nazarite, was the shaving of the head. But he was supposed to be a Nazarite from birth. And so this whole thing about a razor was as a baby, and as the baby begins to grow, there comes a point in a baby boy's life, as the hair begins to grow, that you have that first haircut, which is kind of an emotional, significant event for the mother, the first haircut for the boy. And that was not to happen with Samson. She was not to cut his hair. But Samson, as he grew up and was able to process this information, he was supposed to live as a Nazarite, which he did not do, except the fact that he never cut his hair. So it brings the question to us, is that, did he understand anything else about being a Nazarite other than don't cut my hair? The way he lived his life, it doesn't look like he understood that at all. And so telling Delilah about his hair seems to be the only thing he knew, except for the fact, like we mentioned before, the way he did live his life with all of this death around him and everything, and still having the strength of the Lord physically enabling him to do what he did, it seemed to be give him the impression that it really didn't matter, all this stuff. So we're kind of left with a little bit of, questioning what on earth is going on. But from the perspective of what we do know about Samson and his life, is that this sign of being a Nazarite was a significant one. It was one that he was aware of, and he violated that. The one thing that he was sure of in terms of what it meant to be a Nazarite, he violated that. And the strength of the Lord left him, and he didn't know it. And so we've mentioned this before, but it does raise the question, when did he know the Spirit of the Lord was with him? We don't have any indication. We are told as readers of the Samson narrative when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. But how often when Samson was engaged in battle, did he say things like David said to the Philistine Goliath, "You are mocking Israel and the God of Israel, and I come to you in the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the God of Israel will take care of you." Do we hear those kinds of words coming out of Samson's mouth? No, we don't. So this whole spiritual cultural decline that we see in the book of Judges, we see reflected in Samson's life. He didn't know the Lord had left him because he was unaware of when the Lord was with him. And he goes out under presumption rather than faith. This is a huge point that we will have to talk about tomorrow. Any last questions or comments?
The difference between presumption and faith, like how fine a line, are you going to go into that tomorrow, or how fine a line is that?
It is a very significant point. It's a huge deal. And so we will go into that tomorrow. Okay. All right. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.